Hello and welcome to part 2 of this 3-part video series about the historical Pontius Pilate. Part 1 was all about Pontius Pilate through the eyes of the biblical authors. What did the Bible have to say about Pontius Pilate? Part 2, the video you're watching now, is all about the non-biblical sources of Pontius Pilate. So what sources are out there that are outside of the Bible that still talk about Pontius Pilate? And then part 3 will be combining the biblical and non-biblical sources for Pontius Pilate to see what kind of a picture we get of him. And we'll end that video by talking about how Pontius Pilate was actually a pretty controversial figure in early Christianity. And we'll also talk about how he is still often misunderstood even today. Let's start off with the best non-biblical source for Pontius Pilate. And this source actually predates the Gospels by over 30 years. And this is really good historically. The closer the source is to when the person lived, usually the more reliable the source. And this source pretty much proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Pontius Pilate really did exist. And this source is the Pilate Stone. The Pilate Stone was discovered in 1961 by the Italian archaeologist Antonio Frava, discovered in the ruins of an ancient theater in Caesarea. Up until this point in time, there was no concrete archaeological evidence that Pontius Pilate ever existed. The Pilate Stone is a piece of carved limestone with a partially intact inscription mentioning Pontius Pilate. The Pilate Stone was written in Latin and is translated as, "To the divine Augustus this Tiberium." And then it breaks off, Pontius Pilate, and then it breaks off again, Prefect of Judea, breaks off again, has dedicated this. Antonio Frava, the one who discovered the stone, said he could easily fill in the blanks, and he translated it as, "Pontius Pilate, Prefect of Judea, has presented the Tiberium to the Caesareans." So even though the Pilate Stone is incomplete, our best and earliest source for Pontius Pilate calls him a Prefect of Judea. Notice, it does not call him a procurator, like Josephus and Tacitus do, but it calls him a prefect, which might sound like a minor point to make a big fuss about, but it's important to know that Roman governors were called prefects up until the reign of the Roman Emperor Claudius, who reigned from 41 to 54 CE. It was during his reign that the name of a Roman governor changed from a prefect to a procurator. So what does this information tell us? Well, it tells us that the gospel writers were correct. Pontius Pilate governed Judea because he was a prefect, and prefects governed provinces. So it's likely that Pontius Pilate really did exist and governed the province of Judea. Next, we turn to Flavius Josephus, who was a Jewish Roman historian who wrote his most influential works in the mid-70s CE. Josephus was born in Jerusalem in 37 CE, so he would have certainly been able to get eyewitness accounts of the life and governorship of Pontius Pilate. The first story in Josephus that I'd like to discuss is found in both the Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish Wars. And for those of you who don't know, those are his two most influential writings, and this story is found in both of them. We get a story about Pilate trying to smuggle in a statue of the Roman Emperor Caesar Tiberius into Jerusalem. Pilate does this at night, presumably to be sneaky, because he knows this isn't going to go over well with the Jewish communities living there. And sure enough, the Jews are not happy about this, because they are not supposed to worship any image. This goes against the Mosaic law found in the Torah. This image was likely supposed to be worshipped, because in ancient Rome they had something called the Imperial cult, which is a Roman-sanctioned nationwide religion, which says that the Roman emperor is to be worshipped as a demigod, or even a full-blown divine being. Now obviously bringing this into the Jewish capital in Jerusalem, where the temple is and where Jews from all over the ancient Near East would travel at least 3 different times a year for the 3 Jewish pilgrimage festivals, did not sit well with the Jews who were living there. The Jews then rushed off to Caesarea, where Pilate was living, to implore him to remove the image from Jerusalem and to uphold the laws of their ancestors. Pilate refused. So the Jews fell prostrate around Pilate's house for 5 days, and on the 6th day, Pilate took his seat on the tribunal in the great stadium and summoned the multitude of people to give them an answer. But instead, he arranged a signal to his army to surround the Jews and threatened to kill them if they refused to accept Caesar's images. When Pilate's soldiers took out their swords, the Jewish people stuck out their necks and said, "We would rather die than transgress the laws of our ancestors." Pilate was so amazed at their religious zeal that he took the images away from Jerusalem back to Caesarea. And this ends the first story we get of Pilate in Josephus. Okay, so from this story, we are already learning that Pontius Pilate was a pretty ruthless man. Josephus tells us in the Antiquities of the Jews that no other Roman governor of Judea even tried to bring in the statue of the emperor or the Roman standards because they knew it was a bold step that went against the Jewish practices. So Pilate is considered a bold man by Josephus, and Pilate certainly doesn't seem to care about causing an uprising amongst the Jewish community. The next story about Pontius Pilate in Josephus is a story about the construction of an aqueduct to bring water into Jerusalem, and this story can also be found in both the Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish Wars. Pilate is said to have wanted to use the sacred temple treasury to pay for the construction of an aqueduct to bring water to Jerusalem. It's not so much the fact that he wanted to build an aqueduct, but it's the fact that he wanted to use the money from the temple treasury to fund the project. This is what didn't sit well with the Jews. Josephus tells us that tens of thousands of men assembled and cried out against Pilate, imploring him not to do this. Pilate then ordered his armed troops to put on civilian Jewish garments and intersperse themselves within the Jewish crowd. Pilate's troops were not to use their swords, but were to beat any egregious rioters with clubs. Pilate ordered the Jews to withdraw, and when they did not, he gave his orders to signal the attack. Josephus tells us that Pilate's soldiers inflicted much harsher blows than Pilate had originally anticipated. This caused many Jews to die, and the Jews that were lucky enough to not die by the sword either escaped or were killed by being trampled to death. Then we get the most famous story in all of Josephus's writings, and that is the so-called Testimonium Flavianum, which stands for the testimony of Flavius Josephus, which can be found in chapter 18 in the Antiquities of the Jews. This is a highly controversial passage, and I think there's good reason for us to take this passage with a grain of salt. The Testimonium Flavianum is the most famous story told by Josephus because in it he mentions Jesus and calls him a wise man. And actually, he even struggles to call him a man. Josephus calls Jesus the Messiah and tells us that Pilate condemned him to be crucified, just like what we find in the Gospel accounts. The reliability of the Testimonium Flavianum must be called into question, because many scholars believe that this was interpolated into the text by a Christian living at a later date. Thus, Josephus very well may not have even written this passage, and I personally believe that there are reasons we should be skeptical of this. But I don't want to go too deep into this because this is not the purpose of this video. The point is even though this likely wasn't written by Josephus, it still does contain some early information about Pontius Pilate. But the source isn't great because there's some clear Christian bias, and this Christian may have just gotten his information from the Gospel accounts, so it wouldn't constitute a unique account of Pontius Pilate. Moving on now to the last story Josephus has for us concerning Pontius Pilate, and this story takes place on Mount Gerizim in Samaria. The geography of this area is important for this story, so Jerusalem is located in the south, where Pilate's jurisdiction is, and just north of Judea is Samaria, and Galilee is north of that. This story is about an unnamed man that Josephus calls a spreader of lies. And apparently this man was gathering a group of people to go up on Mount Gerizim to look for vessels that Moses left up there. And for these Jews, Mount Gerizim is the most holy mountain in Samaria. And he actually is successful. He gathers a group of people to go there. His followers did follow him to Mount Gerizim, and they took weapons with them. They posted themselves in a village named Tirathana at the base of Mount Gerizim. But before they could ascend the mountain, Pilate blocked their projected route up with a detachment of cavalry and heavily armed infantry. Pilate's soldiers encountered some of the first comers to the village and slaughtered some of them and forced the others to flee. These soldiers took many prisoners, and Pilate put to death the leaders and the most influential fugitives. When this uprising subsided, the council of the Samaritans went to Vitellius, a consul and governor of Syria, which Pilate was subordinate to, and charged Pilate with the slaughter of the victims. The Samaritans told Vitellius that the multitude gathered at Tirathana weren't rebels against Rome, but a group of refugees fleeing from the persecution of Pilate. Which makes me think the Samaritans were lying to Vitellius, because in Josephus we are told that they are there to go on top of Mount Gerizim to try and find the holy vessels of Moses. And so we have to ask this historical question: did the Samaritans ever try to flee the persecution of Pilate, or not? Josephus goes on to tell us that Vitellius dispatched Marcellus to take charge of the administration of Judea and ordered Pilate to return to Rome to give the emperor his account of what happened. But by the time Pilate got to Rome, the emperor Tiberius had already passed away. This passage also tells us that Pilate was governor over Judea for over 10 years. So that's everything Josephus has to say about Pontius Pilate. Now let's move to Philo of Alexandria in his writing titled On the Embassy to Gaius, written perhaps as early as 41 CE. Now this source is interesting because technically it comes before Josephus' writings, and usually earlier is better. Here, Josephus records a story very much like the one Josephus tells us about, the one about the statue of the emperor that Pilate tried to smuggle into Jerusalem. Except in this story, Philo tells us it's shields, and actually shields are in Josephus' story as well, but Philo doesn't tell us about the statue or the bust of the emperor Tiberius. It was just the shields in the Roman standards. And these shields Pilate dedicates to Herod's palace, which is located in Jerusalem. And these shields likely had images on them that were unacceptable to the Jews, likely promoting the imperial cult. The Jews petitioned Pilate to remove the shields, and he refused. Then Philo interjects and says, Pilate is a man of a very inflexible disposition. He is merciless and stubborn. The Jews tell Pilate not to make war and not to destroy the peace. They also tell him that the Emperor Tiberius does not desire that their laws be violated, and if he does, Pilate has to provide proof. Pilate takes offense at this request, afraid he might actually be forced to go to the emperor and be impeached. Philo also tells us that Pilate is corrupt due to his acts of insolence. Philo then gives a laundry list of awful things that Pilate does, like taking people's property, and that he has a habit of insulting people, and is cruel, and is continually murdering innocent people without a proper trial, and that his inhumanity is never ending and most grievous. He is also exceedingly angry, and is at all times a man of ferocious passions. Philo tells us that Pilate did not want to take down what he had set up, because of Tiberius's firmness. But the Jews perceived that he was inclined to change his mind, but still Pilate didn't do it. So the Jews wrote a letter to Tiberius. Then we are told that Tiberius read the letter and uttered some awful things about Pilate. Tiberius was furious at Pilate and wrote him a letter back, reproaching and reviling him in the most bitter manner for his act of unprecedented audacity and wickedness, and commanding him to immediately take down the shields and to take them away from Judea to Caesarea. This section ends by Philo telling us that Pilate did take the shields away to honor the emperor and to preserve the ancient customs of Jerusalem. So that's Philo. And in Philo, we can get a pretty clear picture of how he views Pontius Pilate, and it isn't pretty. To Philo, Pontius Pilate is a corrupt monster and murderer. Our last text-based ancient source for Pontius Pilate comes from Tacitus in the Annals of Imperial Rome, written between 115 to 120 CE. Tacitus does not mince words. He is clearly not a Christian and thinks the Christian religion is an abomination. But Tacitus does tell us that a hated group of people called the Christians were present in Rome. He tells us that they are called Christians because they followed someone named Christus, Christ in Latin, who suffered the penalty of death during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of the governor Pontius Pilate, and that Jesus' death stopped the faith for a moment, but that it broke out again not only in Judea, but also in Rome. So that's all Tacitus tells us about Pontius Pilate. So it's not a lot, but from this we can assume that Pontius Pilate really was a real person and really did govern in ancient Judea, because Tacitus lived within 100 years after the death of Jesus, and he would have known if Pontius Pilate wasn't the governor of Judea, so it's likely he really did exist. He certainly would not have included the little bit about Pontius Pilate in with those awful Christians if he didn't think Pontius Pilate was really there. The only other sources we have for Pontius Pilate come from bronze coins called prutas, which he minted when he was prefect in Judea. We can tell from these coins that Pilate was determined to promote a form of Roman religion in Judea, regardless of whether this was offensive to the Jews or not, which corroborates Josephus and Philo's accounts. On Pilate's coins, Pilate depicts Roman symbolism connected with the imperial cult, such as the Simplum and the Lituus. These symbols would certainly have offended the Jews, considering they would have to handle these coins on a daily basis. A Simplum looks like this. It's a ladle with a long handle, used to make libations in Roman sacrificial ceremonies. It can also be seen here and here. The Simplum was a sign of the Roman priesthood. The Lituus was a crooked staff or wand used as a cult instrument in ancient Roman religion by augurs, aka ancient Roman priests, to mark out a ritual space in the sky called a tempulum. When the birds flew through this area, it would indicate either divine favor or disfavor for certain events or endeavors. So as you can imagine, Pilate minting these coins would have been incredibly offensive to the Jews living in Judea. So there you have it. We just looked at the best biblical and non-biblical sources concerning Pontius Pilate within the first 100 years after the death of Jesus. And technically, there are other sources about Pontius Pilate that would fall into the category of the first 100 years after the death of Jesus. And I'm thinking of the Gospel of Peter, and the letter to the Trallians, and the letter to the Smyrnaeans by Ignatius of Antioch. But as I mentioned earlier, these sources likely just got their information from the Gospels, so they don't constitute a unique account of Pontius Pilate. You would think our quest to hunt down the historical Pontius Pilate would be coming to a close, considering we just looked at all of the biblical and non-biblical sources about him. But actually, there are a few other ways we can learn new things about Pontius Pilate. The first thing is to take a look at other ancient Roman prefects to see how they governed and how they functioned in the ancient world. This will help us understand how Pontius Pilate came to power, even though we have no written sources that express this. And the other thing is by looking at Pontius Pilate's name. So here is a short, and I mean very short, list of things that we can know about Pontius Pilate solely based off of his title as a Roman prefect. Pilate's title of prefect implies that his duties were mostly military. However, despite having troops, they were likely more of his police force than his military force. However, a prefect's duties went beyond just military matters. He would have been head of the judicial system, giving him the power to impose capital punishment. He would have been responsible for collecting tributes and taxes, and for distributing funds, including the minting of coins, which we have hard evidence for. He would have had a small amount of local control, and would have shared in a limited amount of civil and religious power within the Jewish Sanhedrin. Being the Roman prefect of Judea was a position of relatively low honor, and being pretty low on the totem pole, at least in terms of the Roman political hierarchy. But we do know that as a Roman prefect of Judea, Pilate had the right to appoint the Jewish high priest. The previous governor of Judea, Valerius Gratus, appointed Caiaphas, and Pilate kept Caiaphas as the high priest for his entire tenure. Caiaphas was removed from the high priesthood when Pilate was removed from the governorship. This indicates that Caiaphas and the priests of the Sadducee sect were reliable allies to Pilate. And this can really help us understand Pilate in the gospel accounts, but more on this in part 3's video. Now let us turn to his name, Pontius Pilate. The name Pontius could be derived from the name of the ancient province of Pontus, located in Asia Minor. In Greek, it's pronounced Pontus, meaning sea. However, Pontius is more likely a Roman family name with Samnite roots, coming from the land of Samnium in central southern Italy, likely originating from the Oscan language. If this is true, then his name could mean fifth, which is a cognate of the Latin quintus. And I'm not sure if this is a coincidence or not, but if his name really does mean fifth, then Pontius Pilate was the fifth governor of Judea whose name was Fifth. It's kind of interesting. Now on to the name Pilate, which is his cognomen, or third name for ancient Roman citizens. Cognomens are usually nicknames or names they earned for themselves in the Roman military. Cognomens eventually also became hereditary names that were passed on from generation to generation as well. Pilate could mean skilled with the javelin, which could indicate that Pilate won this name for himself while serving in the Roman military, but it could also mean that his father acquired this name in battle. Pilate could also mean Phrygian cap, indicating that one of Pilate's ancestors was a freedman. We can say with some level of confidence that Pilate and his ancestors were of the equestrian rank in ancient Rome, because many people with Samnite ancestors were. If he was of the equestrian rank, Pilate would have been well educated, somewhat wealthy, and well connected politically and socially. According to the cursus honorum established by Augustus for office holders of equestrian rank, Pilate would have had military command before becoming prefect of Judea. So we can say that it is likely that Pontius Pilate served in the Roman military and that he had some level of engagement in Roman politics before becoming prefect of Judea. And this brings us to the end of part 2 of a 3-part video series on the historical Pontius Pilate. The next video will be all about combining the biblical and non-biblical sources to give us a true picture of Pontius Pilate. And we'll end that video by talking about how Pontius Pilate is really a controversial figure in early Christianity. If you are thirsty for more knowledge, you can check out part 3's video right here. Unless, of course, you're watching this before I release the part 3 video, in which case you'll have to settle for this random, hopefully entertaining video. Thanks for watching.